Charles Jefferson never expected trouble that day. At 72, he had lived through enough history to understand how the world worked. But he had also earned the right to enjoy his routine. Every afternoon, like clockwork, he walked the 2 blocks down to Joe's coffee shop on Lincoln Avenue in St. Louis. The barista, a young college student named Ryan, knew his preferences: a small black coffee with no sugar and a corner seat by the window, where he could watch the world go by at his usual pace. Charles liked the stability. The hum of conversation, the smell of fresh coffee, the scrape of chairs against hardwood floors. He read the newspaper from cover to cover, folding it neatly before the sweltering Missouri heat became unbearable. It was his time, a small corner of peace that he treasured. But peace was always fragile. As he stepped out of the cafe, coffee in hand and newspaper tucked under his arm, he heard the sound of a patrol car approaching. The black and white police car rolled slowly to a stop in front of him. The window rolled down, and for a moment Charles considered whether to continue walking. Maybe they weren't here for him. But then the door opened. 2 police officers got out. One was young, in his early 20s, with short hair and a stiff posture. The other was older, in his mid-40s, a heavy-set man with the air of someone used to wielding his power. Neither of them seemed particularly friendly. "Sir, may we see your identification?" the younger man asked, his tone clearly practiced. Charles paused, blinking at them. His heart wasn't racing, it didn't need to be. He'd been through this before, too many times to count. He slowly set his coffee cup down on a nearby bench and reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet. But before he could open it, the older cop raised his hand, his eyes narrowing warily. "Wait, what are you doing?" Charles paused, his old eyes scanning the man's face. "I'm just taking my papers," he replied, his voice calm. There was a moment of silence, then the younger cop nodded. "Take your time, sir." Charles opened his wallet, took out his driver's license and identification, and handed them over without saying anything. The younger cop checked the papers while the older man stood there, arms crossed, eyes searching. Passers-by began to take notice. Ryan, the student barista in the cafe, peeked out the window. A woman walking her dog slowed down, frowning at the scene before her. No one said anything, but tension hung in the air. The young cop handed back the papers, nodding. "Mr. Jefferson, do you know why we stopped you?" Charles sighed, pocketing his wallet. "I guess not." The older cop looked at his partner, then at Charles. But instead of continuing to question him, he frowned when Charles pulled out his phone. It was a simple gesture, but it changed everything. Charles dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear. The other end picked up almost immediately. "Hello, honey." The room froze. Not because Charles was calling, but because someone recognized the name on his phone screen, Dr. Eleanor Jefferson, one of the city's most prominent attorneys, who had been outspoken in his criticism of police abuses. The young cop glanced at his partner, a hint of concern in his eyes. "What's up, Dad?" Eleanor's voice came through the speaker. Charles smiled slightly. "Nothing, honey. I was just having an interesting conversation with the St. Louis police. You might want to know." The older cop cleared his throat, stepping back a little. The tension in the air suddenly changed. The people around him began to talk too. A moment later, the younger cop nodded slightly, as if realizing he was on a dangerous path. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. You may go." Charles looked at them, his eyes unsurprised. He simply nodded, picked up his coffee cup, adjusted the newspaper under his arm, and continued walking, as if nothing had happened. But he knew. And they knew. Their world had just been turned upside down. His father had warned him about moments like this. So his grandfather tilted his head slightly, his old but sharp eyes scanning the 2 policemen standing before him. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was calm, but there was a thin layer of defense underneath. The older officer shifted, his hand on his belt, closer to his gun than necessary. "We've had a call about a suspicious person. Fits your description." Charles glanced around the sidewalk, which was not crowded but still had enough people to see. A woman pushing a stroller slowed down, her eyes scanning the scene. A man on a bicycle turned to look. The atmosphere changed, the air thickened. He sighed, a quiet sigh but heavy with suspicion. He looked down at himself, khakis buttoned neatly, a neatly trimmed gray beard, a newspaper tucked under his arm, a steaming cup of coffee. Then he looked up, his voice quiet but clear. "Are you sure?" The younger officer squared his shoulders, trying to regain control of the situation. "We'll just check your ID. Standard procedure." Charles had two choices: comply and move on, or stand firm and face the situation. He was used to this dance, the steps repeated over decades. But he was no fool. His hand slid silently into his pocket, his fingers brushing the edge of his old leather wallet. But as he did, the older cop stepped forward, his hand pressed against the car, creating an invisible barrier. The touch was more than just a check. It was a warning. Charles's body stiffened. The noise of the street faded. He sensed the change. This was no longer just an ID check. No longer routine. No longer random. Before he could take out his identification, the older officer grabbed his wrist. The grip was stronger than necessary. "Turn your hands around the car." The tone no longer concealed its falseness. Charles's chest tightened. Memories flooded back, news reports, stories passed down through generations, moments that ended in tragedy. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm despite the storm inside him. "I'm a 72-year-old man walking home from the coffee shop. What exactly am I being detained for?" The younger officer hesitated. His eyes flicked to his partner. The confidence in his stance had loosened. But the older officer only tightened his grip. "You fit the description," he repeated, as if that explained everything. Charles felt the eyes of those around him. A young black man with headphones on paused mid-sentence, his eyes leaving his phone screen to watch the scene before him. No one said anything, but they all watched. And in that moment, Charles understood that there were some battles you could never back down from. His phone was held low, just enough to record everything. A middle-aged woman in scrubs lingered by her car, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. She watched closely, not him, but someone else. Someone Charles couldn't see. Someone who had her phone raised, waiting. Charles sighed, his breathing heavy in the stifling evening air. He kept his hands where they could see. "I don't resist, I don't fight, I don't run." Those were the words he'd told his daughter when she was little. Those were the same words his father had taught him as a child. But now, none of that mattered. The older cop reached forward, patting him down with familiar roughness. His rough hands pressed hard into Charles's pockets, down his chest, and down his sides. Charles clenched his jaw. A deep, bitter disappointment seeped into his bones. The humiliation was not new, but it never got any easier. "Do you have a weapon?" the younger officer asked, his voice hesitant. He was still standing slightly behind his superior, his eyes worried. Charles let out a dry laugh, without any humor in it. "Do I look like I have a weapon?" He tilted his head slightly, meeting the younger officer's eyes. "Do you know why you're doing this?" The younger officer swallowed, his eyes flickering, but he didn't answer. The older man remained steadfast, unwavering. "Just check, cooperate, and you're on your way." A lie. Charles had seen this go too far before. Men like him, who had complied, who had cooperated, had ended up with a knee on their neck. Or worse. He exhaled slowly, carefully. "I'll get my phone." The older cop's body tensed, his eyes as sharp as a knife about to cut through someone's neck. "Hands where I can see them." Charles slowly pulled out his phone, not making any sudden movements. "I'm calling my daughter." The younger cop frowned, his lips pressed together. Sir, just. But Charles had already dialed. 1 ring. 2 rings. Then she answered. Hello, Dad. What's up? Her voice was sharp and focused. As soon as he heard it, Charles finally allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. She always knew when something was wrong. The older cop frowned. Who's he calling? Charles locked eyes with him. A moment of awkward silence. Then he spoke, clearly, firmly. My daughter is in the United States. Attorney General. Time froze. For the first time since the officers had stepped out of the car, there was silence. There was a palpable hesitation. The older officer paused for a moment before clenching his jaw. The younger officer, following his experienced counterpart, looked less confident. Charles held the phone, the screen still lit. His daughter's voice came through the speaker, clear, sharp. Dad, where are you? He didn't take his eyes off the officers. Lincoln Road, right outside Joe's Cafe. There was a brief pause. Charles could picture his daughter's face right now, her brow furrowed, her thoughts quickly plotting her next steps. Then her tone changed. Cold. Controlling. Dangerous. Put me on speakerphone. Without hesitation, Charles turned up the volume and held the phone between them. This is Monica Jefferson, Attorney General of the United States. Who am I speaking to? Her voice was like a knife cutting through the air. The younger officer stiffened, instinctively taking a step back, his eyes flicking to his colleague, who still kept his hands close to his waist. The older officer was slower to react, but Charles saw the way his fingers twitched. He knew they had made a mistake. Ma'am. The older officer began, his voice suddenly softer. I don't care who you are, Monica interrupted. You are detaining my father, a 72-year-old man, without cause. I demand an immediate explanation. The crowd was much larger now. Phones were raised, recording everything. A woman in a navy jacket whispered to the person next to her. A teenager stood near the curb, his eyes darting between the officers and the phone in Charles's hand. The older officer licked his lips. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut. Charles kept his eyes calm, but he knew in his heart, the tables had turned. We got a call about a suspicious person. What's suspicious about him? Monica's voice left no room for hesitation. She had no time for half answers. Is he committing a crime? Is he a threat? The younger officer stood, glancing briefly at his partner as if for guidance. Answer me. The silence stretched. Finally, the older officer swallowed. His face hardened. It's a misunderstanding. Monica breathed heavily through the phone. Charles could hear her barely contained frustration. A misunderstanding? That's what you call it? The younger officer, clearly confused, looked at his partner. He waited for guidance, something to defuse the situation. But the older cop had nothing more to say. No explanation, no excuse. Just a heavy silence. Charles adjusted the phone in his hand, his voice more direct. What do you want me to do? Are you free to go? Monica asked. Neither officer answered immediately. Charles turned to look at them, waiting. Me too. His voice was even, but there was an undeniable weight. The older officer's jaw clenched. Then, with obvious reluctance, he took a step back. The younger officer nodded quickly, his hand leaving his belt. Yes, sir. You're free to go. Charles didn't move immediately. He let the moment pass, letting the weight of it settle around them. Like a final plea in court. Finally, he glanced at the two officers one last time before raising the phone to his ear. Are you still there, Liv? Her voice was steady. Here. Charles allowed himself a smile, just a small smirk. I guess I'll see you for dinner. And just like that, he was gone. But the world didn't stop. Charles walked slowly, rhythmically. His back was straight, his head held high. He didn't rush, didn't run. He left on his own terms. Behind him, the silence stretched. The officers who had once been so confident in their authority stood still. The older officer's fists were clenched at his sides, each movement stiff with frustration. The younger officer looked down, as if contemplating something he hadn't thought about before. Someone's phone was still recording. Charles knew what was happening. He knew this moment wouldn't stop at Lincoln Avenue. It was headed straight for the world. But he wasn't done yet. He stopped, turned slowly, his eyes scanning the onlookers. The phone was still in his hand, the screen glowing with images of the police, the crowd, and himself. I hope you learned something today. His voice was calm, even. But there was something else in his eyes, not just determination, but defiance, the suppressed anger from years of seeing this happen over and over again. Because a lot of people were about to find out about you. The older officer bristled. He opened his mouth, his voice full of resistance. Sir, we just don't. Charles cut him off with a shake of his head. There was no reason. He knew what they were doing. He looked at the crowd, and they looked back. A woman in tights, a witness who had watched the whole thing, nodded slightly, as if to confirm what had just happened. A man in a mechanic's uniform laughed dryly, his eyes filled with mockery. They thought they could make some old man suffer, he muttered, didn't expect him to have the right connections, huh? The older officer stared at the crowd, his face darkening. But the younger officer, who had retained some of his sanity, nudged him gently by the elbow and shook his head. They were in too deep. There was no way to undo what had been done. Charles put the phone back to his ear. Are you still there, Monica? Her voice rang out, sharp and steady. I'm here, Dad. Charles nodded, his eyes never leaving the officers before him. Loud enough for them to hear, he said. I think these officers are realizing, they may need a new job soon. The older officer's jaw clenched. The younger one swallowed, his throat dry. A tense silence fell. Then a new sound cut through the air, the static from the patrol car's radio. Post 47, how are you doing? The officers hesitated. The older man's lips parted, as if he wanted to say something, anything to regain control of the moment. But nothing could take back the past 10 minutes. Charles exhaled slowly, slipping his phone into his pocket. Officers, you have a good day now. Then he turned, his eyes sweeping over the onlookers one last time, before walking away, leaving behind a reality that no one could deny. Charles didn't look back. He didn't need to. The power shift had happened, silently but unmistakably. The officers weren't chasing him. They weren't giving orders anymore. They were standing there, motionless, as if the weight of their own failure had pinned them to the ground. The tension in the air was so intense it could have been torn to shreds. The crowd was still watching, silent but not indifferent. The phones were still held aloft, recording the moment, preserving irrefutable evidence. This wasn't just about Charles anymore. This was about all the men who had been stopped because of the color of their skin. About the fathers who had taught their sons how to survive unjust stops. About stories that had ended in tragedy, and about one that almost did. A woman in a navy jacket stepped forward. She kept her eyes on the officers, her phone still trained on them. Badge number, she asked, her voice calm but sharp. The younger officer opened his mouth, then closed it. His counterpart was still trying to cling to the power that was slipping from his grasp. Ma'am, you need to step back. The woman raised an eyebrow, a half-smile flickering across her face. She glanced at the crowd around her, then back. We all saw what happened. Do you really want to dig a deeper hole? The older officer glared but remained silent. The younger swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, it was all a misunderstanding. A small, sarcastic chuckle rippled through the crowd. A mechanic leaned against a lamppost, his arms crossed over his chest. Funny how these misunderstandings always happen to the same people. The officers knew they were losing ground. They could feel the rage simmering in the air, in the eyes of the crowd, in the phones still spinning. Charles kept walking. His stride was steady, his head held high. He had won today, but winning was not the same as justice. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Monica. He pressed answer. Still watching. Her voice was small but firm. The video is live, Dad. He wasn't surprised. How bad? A pause. Bad for them. Charles nodded to himself. He had lived long enough to know that this was only the beginning. They'll make a statement. Monica continued, her tone almost emotionless. Charles expected words like review and procedural review. But of course, there was no apology. Charles sighed, a long, heavy sigh. What would happen next? There was a pause. Then Monica said what he already knew. We'll continue to monitor. Charles stood in the middle of Lincoln Avenue, his eyes scanning the world before him. Today, the world had seen something else. Something that couldn't be ignored. Something that couldn't be denied. The eyes around him were no longer those of indifferent strangers. Some nodded, not out of pity, but because they knew, this time, it wasn't just about him. By the time Charles got home, his legs were aching, as if the weight of years of struggle were pressing down on them. But his mind was racing. 72 years, he'd lived through a lot. But today was different. He wasn't just another black man stopped for no reason. This time, the world watched. And this time, the world didn't look away. He eased himself into his favorite chair, the one by the window, where he could see the street outside. The neighborhood looked the same. But the air was charged, like the moment before a storm. He turned on the TV. And there it was. His face, frozen in time, captured on shaky cell phone video. Breaking news. St. Louis police stop elderly man for no reason. His daughter is in the United States. The Attorney General intervened. The newscasters had begun to break down the story. Clips of the officers surrounding him. The moment they realized they had made a mistake. The heated discussions, should they be fired? Do we need a new policy? Or is this just another racist incident, one that will soon be forgotten? His phone buzzed. Messages from old friends, from students he had taught, from strangers who had somehow found his number. Some were angry. Some just wanted to tell him they supported him. And then, on the screen, an official statement from the St. Louis Police Department flashed. We are aware of an incident involving 2 officers and an individual. Again, the same empty, carefully crafted words, no emotion, no acknowledgement of responsibility. Charles was not surprised. But this time, he knew. This time, the world knew. The department was conducting an internal review. That's what they always said. The words were repeated like a tired song, polished to make no waves, to leave no scars. But Charles knew, everyone knew, how hollow they sounded. The police were fair and square. A promise that fell on deaf ears. The phone rang. A familiar ringtone. Monica. Hello, Dad. Charles closed his eyes, the voice pulling him back to the present, to what was really happening. He pictured his daughter, her tone no longer cheerful, but tense, worried. They're trying to get her under control, Dad, she whispered. But it's too late. Charles leaned back, watching the TV screen. The news played back video from different angles. Security camera footage, bystander phones, live feeds. The same moment, over and over again, each time with a new perspective, each time with a different flare of anger. What do you think they'll do? Monica asked, her voice fading. There was a long pause. Charles swallowed the bitterness that had built up in his throat. They'll let the anger burn itself out, he replied, his voice low. They'll wait for the news cycle to continue, for another story to take its place. But this time there's something different, Monica said. This video is everywhere. It's not just on the news, it's on social media, in conversations, in the eyes of millions who saw it and couldn't turn away. Charles tapped his fingers on the armrest of his chair. I'm tired, Liv. I know. Monica didn't need to ask. She understood. They sat in silence, only the sound of the TV filling the space. A moment to breathe, to listen to the storm brewing outside. This isn't over, Monica whispered. Charles glanced out the window. A news van had pulled up at the end of the street. The reporters got out, cameras ready, eyes fierce. He tightened his grip on the phone. No, he said, barely audible. It's just beginning. The phone rang again. A text message from a familiar number, an old friend, a retired professor. Proud of you, it read. This needed to happen. Charles looked at the screen, then back out the window. The storm wasn't far away. And this time, he wasn't sure he could stand by and watch. Charles stared at the message for a long moment. The screen lit up in the dim room, reflecting the cold words onto his face. His fingers were still on the edge of the phone, as if the slightest movement would break the thick silence inside. He wasn't sure if proud was the right word. Part of him wanted to believe it, but the rest felt only a tired emptiness. He hadn't intended to make a statement. He just wanted to go home. The knock on the door was gentle, but enough to snap him back to reality. He knew who it was, even before he got up to answer it. Monica was there. She crossed her arms, her sharp gaze scanning him like a doctor examining invisible wounds. Her features reflected strength, but there was an undisguised worry in her brown eyes. She had flown. Of course she had. I told you not to come. His voice was low, tinged with exhaustion. Monica didn't reply, only stepping in when he stepped aside. She looked at him. You know I will. Not a question. A fact. They sat in the living room. The TV hummed in the background, a news anchor reading numbers, images of last night's protests flashing across the screen. The world was spinning faster than ever, and Charles was right in the eye of the storm. Monica sighed, rubbing her temples. They'll spin this around, Dad. The department will do an internal review, maybe suspend a few officers, with pay. And then next week, everyone will forget. Charles nodded slowly. You know how this goes. Monica leaned forward, her voice sharpening. But we can't let them get away with this. He looked at his daughter. She was the Attorney General of the United States, a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice. She had power, she had influence, and she was willing to use it. But Charles was a man who had lived long enough to see history repeat itself. Too many times. Power alone isn't enough, he said quietly. People have to care. He turned to the window. Outside, the neighbors were gathering. Some were talking to reporters, others were just standing there, phones in hand, recording the moment. They were waiting. A slow smile spread across Charles's lips. He nodded, as if he had seen something he had long since given up hope of. They won't forget. Monica leaned against his shoulder. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you really believe that? Charles turned, looking her straight in the eye. I do. Monica took a deep breath, then nodded. Then be sure of it. He chuckled, shaking his head. You've always been stubborn. She shrugged. That's how I raised you. The phone rang again. The storm wasn't over yet. Charles looked at his daughter. Her eyes were clear, reflecting the world he had hoped would be better for her. Another message popped up on the screen. Then another. The notification bell rang incessantly. His inbox was full of questions, pleas for help, voices clamoring for attention. He looked at the screen, then out the window. The city was still bustling, the people still moving as if nothing had changed. But Charles knew that, somewhere among the thousands of messages, there were people who couldn't let this moment go by. They were waiting for something, some action, some sign that they weren't alone. The phone rang. Another call. A strange but urgent voice. We can't let this go on. We have to do something. Charles closed his eyes, took a deep breath. For so long he had fought alone, but now he realized, this was never his fight. It was everyone's. For those who were speaking out, for those who refused to let the truth be forgotten. He leaned forward, picked up his coffee, which had gone cold. He took a slow sip, letting the bitter taste spread as a reminder of reality. Then with calm certainty, he set the cup down and said, let's get to work. If stories like this matter to you, don't just stand by. Be vigilant. Speak up. Don't let silence overshadow the truth. Hit the subscribe button. Share this story. Make sure the world doesn't turn its back on you. Because change only happens when people refuse to look away.